Okay, in this video we're going to go over the gross domestic product report, and this is an extensive report, but there's only a few tables that are really pertinent to what we're trying to accomplish. And the most important is going to be table 3. So this is the gross domestic product level and change from preceding period. Okay? And what it shows you are effectively the raw numbers for gross domestic product. So a couple things to note here. First off, notice that we have kind of a separation of this report into billions of dollars on in this column here, and then we have billions of chain 2012 dollars here. Okay, what that's doing is it's distinguishing real GDP, I'll put real, from nominal GDP. Okay. This one effectively adjusts for inflation, whereas this one does not. When we adjust for inflation, we have to have some sort of base year prices to use, and that's where we get the 2012 dollars. In other words, when we look at quarter 3 of 2022 gross domestic product, in nominal terms it was 25,723. But in real terms, it was 20,054. Well, what's the difference? You take all the stuff that was produced in quarter 3 of 2022 and stamp it with 2022 prices, you get this number. But if you take that same stuff that was produced in 2022 quarter 3 and you stamp it with 2012 prices, you get this value here. So this is in 2012 prices. This is in 2022 prices. The reason this is important is because as we go from quarter to quarter with nominal data, the number here is going up, but that increase could be a reflection of higher output or higher prices. Whereas when we look at real GDP, the changes from quarter 1 to quarter 2 to quarter 3, notice it actually drops a little bit here and then increases here. Those changes are solely the result of output changes because all of these quarters are priced in 2012 dollars. So prices do not change across time here, but they do change here. Okay, so that's how we inflation adjust. They just use the term chained instead of real. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is the actual GDP and its subcomponents. So, for example, you may have learned in previous macroeconomic classes that GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus net exports. Okay? Very kind of famous equation there. Well, that's what we're getting here in the larger scheme of things. Here we have GDP. So, for example, in let's use nominal data for now. In quarter 3 of 2022, gross domestic product was 25,723. Okay. And then you can break that down and say, well, GDP, the component of that was personal consumption expenditures, or what we call consumption, was 17,542. You could even calculate the percentage. You could say, what is 17,542 divided by 25,723. Let's do that. 17,542 divided by 25,723. So this divided by this, and you get 0.68. Well, that means that personal consumption expenditures were 68% of total GDP. Usually, consumption is around that number, 68, 70, 72%. Consumption is the largest component of our output, and so this gives us the exact number. Okay? So you want to be comfortable calculating the percentage of GDP that each of these subcomponents make up. Okay? And in fact, you can even go further. For example, you'll notice that personal consumption breaks down into 2 categories. It breaks down into goods and services. Consumption, you have goods and services. So maybe in quarter 3 of 2022, we have goods of 5988, and we want to know what fraction of consumption that makes up. So we take 5,988. Let's do this. 5,988, and then we would divide that by consumption, 17,542. And you get, oh, sorry about that, 5,988 divided by 17,542, and you get 34%. So goods make up 34% of consumption. That means that the other category, services, 11,554, if we divide that by personal consumption expenditures, 17,542, you get 65%. Okay? And so what you're getting is a decomposition of consumption into goods and services. Now, that's also telling because we've got an economy today that is very heavily consumption, as illustrated by the 68% number we saw for consumption as a fraction of GDP, but we're also an economy that is heavily service-oriented, as represented by the 65% of consumption goods that are actually services. So it just gives you a sense of what the economy looks like, and then we can use that data to analyze the effects of that later on. Okay, so that's one thing that we can do with these numbers. Now, just to show you how this continues, if you were to go on down the list, you'd see, for example, investment. Let's scroll down and see investment here is called gross private domestic investment. Say investment, so you can get that number as well. If you go to the next page, which is still the same table, then you'll notice you have net exports here. Net exports, exports, imports, and then finally you have government. Okay. So in this table, you're getting the full CIGNX. Now let's take a look at some more detail up here. Okay. Notice that whether we're looking at nominal GDP or real GDP, we have seasonally adjusted annual rates. Okay. What does that mean? Well, seasonal adjustment means that we've removed any changes in output that are related to the seasons. Clearly, there's certain times of the year, every year, where there's more production than other times of the year. And so we factor that out because it's a predictable change, and therefore we don't want to really analyze that. We don't want to see, for example, that every holiday season GDP skyrockets from the non-holiday season, okay? Because we know that pattern occurs all the time. So we remove that pattern and we see only changes unrelated to the natural seasons. And then this one, annual rates, is particularly important because what we're doing here is we're taking quarterly data, for example, quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3 of 2022, and we're annualizing it. To annualize something means taking a less than annual number and turning it into an annual number. For example, okay, if you annualize quarter 3 GDP, you would take quarter 3 GDP and multiply it by 4. So this number here, this 25,723, is actually 4 times what actually happened in quarter 3. So we could de-annualize that and take 25,723 and divide that by 4. And that would give us the actual GDP in quarter 3 of 2022. So the actual GDP was 6,430. Multiply that by 4, and we get an annual rate of 25,723. So if you were asked, what was quarter 3 GDP, it would be 1/4 of this number because it's annualized. The next thing we want to be able to do is calculate growth rates given this data. And normally we would calculate growth rates from one quarter to the next. When you're calculating growth rates, you never use nominal GDP. Because again, if we calculate the growth from quarter 2 to quarter 3, we're going to get a number. But that number is going to reflect both changes in prices and output. Because when we look at nominal GDP, output is changing from quarter 2 to quarter 3, but so are prices. We don't have a fixed price that we're using for both periods. That's why we go over here and we always calculate GDP growth by looking at real GDP. So if we calculate growth from quarter 2 to quarter 3, we know that both quarters are priced in 2012 dollars, so any changes that occur here are solely a result of productivity changes. And when we talk about measuring changes in GDP, we want to measure changes in actual output, not prices. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, we have a growth formula that we're going to use. And it's very simple. Growth is going to be equal to output, which is sometimes abbreviated as Y, in time t, divided by output in time t minus 1 period. And then you're going to take that and subtract 1. Now that looks complicated, but it really isn't. Take a look. If we want to calculate growth rates from quarter 2 of 2022 to quarter 3 of 2022, then we're going to use this formula. We're going to take the growth rate in time t, which is going to be the later period, and it's going to be the output in time t. It's going to be output of 20,054. Okay. And we're going to divide that by the output in the prior period, time t minus 1, 19,895. And then we're going to subtract 1. Okay. Let's do that. Let's take 20,054 divided by 19,895 and subtract 1. Okay. That gives us 0.007. Okay. Now, we want to annualize that change. I should say, if we want to annualize that change, which we do, more on that in a minute, we're going to take this quarterly change here, because this 0.007 is actually the change from quarter 2 to quarter 3. But what if we want to think of that change as annual? We would multiply by 4. And that gives us 0.03, essentially 0.032, which is 3.2%. So we would have 0.007 times 4, which equals 0.032, which is equal to 3.2%. So in essence, the economy grew from quarter 2 of 2022 to quarter 3 of 2022 by 3.2% in annual terms. What was the actual growth rate from quarter 2 to quarter 3? 1/4 of that. Okay. Now, we can actually confirm this because if we go to table number, let me see here, table number 1, this actually does the calculations for you. So table 1 shows that from quarter 2 to quarter 3, which is quarter 3 growth, we had 3.2% change. And notice it says here annual. So we just did the calculation and now we're verifying it. 3.2% here. Okay. 3.2% here. So you can actually practice with this. Take data from table 3, okay, for any particular category, or if you want to look at different periods, and then verify your answers with table 1. The last thing I want to mention is denomination. So I've been referring to just the pure number here of, say, 20,054. But these are in billions of dollars. So when you're in billions, you need to add 9 zeros to these numbers. Effectively move the decimal 9 places to the right. Okay, so this is actually 20 trillion 54 billion.